Hey AP Macro students, it's Mr. White here with some notes for you about the Phillips curve. So go ahead and get out your notes and follow along as we learn about this really important graph that's going to help you understand a lot of what we discuss in Unit 5. All right, so the Phillips curve was developed by, you guessed it, a guy named Phillips back in 1958. This dude named A.W. Phillips from New Zealand did a whole bunch of research on the historical relationship between the rate of unemployment and the rate of inflation in Great Britain. Now, just so you know, from here on out going forward, pi percent means inflation, okay? U% is unemployment. That's just the shorthand that we're going to use, and so get really comfortable with that. Whenever you see pi percent, we're not talking 3.14, we're talking about the rate of inflation, and just keep in mind we've got a lot of other I words like interest, so that's why we just use pi percent for inflation. Pretty standard for macro. Now, Phillips' research indicated that there's a stable but inverse relationship between the rate of unemployment and the rate of inflation. So, in general, as unemployment goes down, inflation goes up, and as unemployment goes up, inflation goes down. That should sound familiar from what we learned about the aggregate model back in Unit 3, excuse me. Now, the implication of Phillips' research was that this relationship could be exploited by policymakers, people in the government. They could use this trade-off and they could reduce unemployment, but at the cost of more inflation. The Phillips curve was basically used as a rationale for Keynesian economics all throughout the 20th century. And if you forgot, Keynesian economics is based on that guy John Maynard Keynes, and he was the one who advised limited government intervention in the economy through fiscal policy. If you don't remember what fiscal policy is, go back and watch the video. That's government influencing economic performance through changing taxes or government spending policies. Now, basically, Phillips just said, look, you guys can change taxes or you can change government spending to reduce unemployment, but just know that there's a trade-off to that, right? Everything has an opportunity cost. And in this case, the opportunity cost is if you cause unemployment to go down, you're going to cause inflation to go up. At the same time, if you're trying to fight inflation and you're trying to bring down the rate of inflation, well, the poison pill that you're going to have to swallow politically is that you're going to have to increase unemployment to fight off inflation. Now, this is what Phillips found in his research. You could see, like if you just basically plotted out unemployment down here along the x-axis and inflation along the y-axis, we can see that throughout the years, maybe in the first year, Phillips found that there was 5% inflation and there was 3% unemployment. Maybe another year he found there was 4% inflation and 5% unemployment. Another year he found there was 3.1% unemployment, inflation, and 6% unemployment or 5.5% unemployment. You get the idea. Now, obviously, we could draw a line through these and it would go all over the place, right? But we can see that in general, the trend, and that's basically what this Phillips curve represents, is the trend. The trend is that whenever we see that one of these is large, right? Like, so if unemployment is large, inflation tends to be small, okay? Or if inflation is large, like here, up here we can see inflation is large, unemployment is small. And so that's what we mean by that inverse relationship as shown by this downward sloping Phillips curve. Now, early on, the Phillips curve ran into some pushback, and actually there are some people who still don't believe in the Phillips curve because in the 1970s, the United States experienced concurrent high unemployment and high inflation, which is a condition known as stagflation. Once again, we studied that back when we learned about the ASAD model. Now, in 1976, American Nobel Prize economist Milton Friedman basically saw stagflation as disproof of a stable Phillips curve. Instead of a trade-off between unemployment and inflation, Friedman and another Nobel laureate, a guy named Edmund Phelps, believed that the natural rate of unemployment was actually independent of the rate of inflation. Now, to show this independent relationship, we added another curve to our graph, which is known as the long-run Phillips curve. So let's take a look at the graph with this long-run Phillips curve. So this is the trouble for the Phillips curve. So obviously we can see what A.W. Phillips saw, but then Friedman saw this, all these extra dots. Look at all these dots out here, right? If you look at all these dots here, you would say, well, then our curve looks something like this, which doesn't look like a relationship at all, right? It doesn't look like a nice, beautiful, downward sloping inverse relationship that A.W. Phillips basically identified. So the way we can resolve this is just by changing up the graph a little bit, okay? We can see that actually we have our natural rate of unemployment down here, right? Remember we said this could be, we just pretend for the sake of this graph, this is 6%, okay? At the natural rate of unemployment, we have what's called the long-run Phillips curve, which is perfectly inelastic. You may remember that perfectly inelastic means straight up and down. That tells us that the rate of inflation is not related to the rate of unemployment, okay? By having a perfectly inelastic curve, it means that this natural rate of unemployment right here is independent of inflation. That, at least in the long run, there's no relationship between those two. Now, what happens here is that we have a long-run Phillips curve and we also have a short-run Phillips curve. And the short-run Phillips curve can explain all of these other dots that are hanging out here. When you understand that there's a short-run Phillips curve that can fluctuate around this long-run Phillips curve, then all of a sudden this starts to look a lot more rational. Okay, so we're going to talk about this short-run Phillips curve and the long-run Phillips curve, and we'll figure out how to analyze these two. So the long-run Phillips curve is basically just a line to mark the natural rate of unemployment, right? Because the long-run Phillips curve exists at that natural rate of unemployment, what we're saying here is that structural changes in the economy that affect unemployment would also cause that long-run Phillips curve to shift. So in other words, the only way the long-run Phillips curve ever moves is if there's a change to the natural rate of unemployment. And on here, we're just going to identify natural rate of unemployment as U with a little n right next to it, okay? So if there's ever an increase in the natural rate of unemployment, the long-run Phillips curve is going to shift to the right. A decrease in the natural rate of unemployment would shift the long-run Phillips curve to the left. Now, just keep in mind, the natural rate of unemployment is like a proxy or a marker that tells us like the normal amount of production that should be happening in the economy. So if the normal amount of production goes down, then that's going to have an effect on our natural rate of unemployment. If the normal amount of production goes up, once again, it's going to affect our natural rate of unemployment. So just understand that much like the long-run aggregate supply, the long-run Phillips curve is very seldom going to move. In most questions you see, we're going to be manipulating that short-run Phillips curve. It would take big structural changes in the economy to move our long-run Phillips curve. All right, so let's talk about the difference between short-run Phillips curve, SRPC, and long-run Phillips curve. Today, most economists reject the concept of a stable Phillips curve. In other words, there's not just like this magical short-run Phillips curve that perfectly slopes downward and that we can always predict how changes in unemployment is going to change the rate of inflation. But instead, today, economists accept that there may be a short-term trade-off, at least, in the short run between like 1 to 2 years, given stable inflation expectations. And so, one term we're going to pay close attention to here is expectations. That's going to be key. Now, most believe that in the long run, unemployment and inflation are independent at the natural rate of unemployment. So in other words, when we're at a normal state of the economy, the unemployment rate and the inflation rate don't affect each other. So when everything is normal, they don't fluctuate. But when we move away from what's normal, that's when they start to become inverse fluctuations, at least in the short run. Okay. Now, modern analysis shows that the short-run Phillips curve may shift left or right. And this is the key to understanding this is changes in inflationary expectations, right? There's that word expectations again. Like I said, expectations are going to be key here. So let's take a look-see at what I mean by all this, because I'm sure you're feeling a little bit confused. All right, so the short-run Phillips curve, right? This is it. It's the downward sloping one. It shows that inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. And because of the fact that we know that there's like all these little dots out here, right? All these anomalies, okay? We add another short-run Phillips curve to explain those guys, right? In other words, we had a different expectation down here at this first short-run Phillips curve. And when we had an expectation of inflation, then, we're going to see fluctuations in unemployment and inflation that correspond to this Phillips curve. But this new Phillips curve up here represents a different expected inflation rate. And we're going to sort of see how that works with our long-run Phillips curve. So here's an example of what I'm talking about, because once again, I'm sure that you're probably confused, and it's kind of hard to conceptualize these two in isolation, so let's put them together, okay? So in this scenario here, I just want to point out a couple things. We've got our inflation right here. We've got our unemployment down here. Pi percent right here is going to be our expected inflation rate. And so why don't we just call this, pi star, okay? And so we can call this SRPC pi star. All right. Now you'll notice that our short run Phillips curve intersects the long run Phillips curve at point A, which indicates that we're at the natural rate of unemployment. So this inflation rate right here, pi star, is the expected inflation rate when we're at the natural rate of unemployment. And actually this situation is our equilibrium, because whenever we're at the natural rate, the expected inflation equals actual inflation. All right, but that only happens, like I said, when we're at the natural rate of unemployment, which remember we said is like 4 to 6%. So when we're at 4 to 6% unemployment, the inflation rate we expect is the inflation rate we get. So like, for example, if this is like 2% inflation, that means that if we're sitting at 5% unemployment, we're going to expect 2% and we're going to actually get 2%. Okay? All right, I hope that makes sense. All right, so right now with the economy in equilibrium, everything is good. Let's see what would happen if we throw in a little scenario here. I'll just erase all this. All right, now let's assume that either the government or the central bank enacts an expansionary policy to reduce the unemployment rate below its natural rate at point A. So, think of something. Think of an expansionary fiscal or monetary policy. What are some expansionaries? Well, we could like cut taxes. Okay, why not? Or we could have the Fed buy bonds. Any of those, right? Choose whichever one you like better. It doesn't matter. They're going to do the exact same thing. Okay. So if that were to happen, if they were to cut taxes, like if the Congress cuts taxes by $1 billion, or if the Fed buys, oh, this says bonds. Helps if I spell correctly. If the Fed buys bonds, what's going to happen here is the unemployment rate is going to fall. But we know that when the unemployment rate falls, at least in the short run, the inflation rate is going to go up. Why is that so? Well, in the short run, assuming that the policy is successful, inflation will occur because as more people get hired, they go spend more money. When more people spend money, businesses have to raise their prices to keep up with all that extra buying. Remember that when we think about our basic supply and demand, supply increases when price increases. So if we want to produce more stuff to meet all the extra demand from all these people with jobs, we have to raise our prices. And that explains why inflation would go up. But the problem here is that when inflation goes up and unemployment goes down, that puts some pressure on the economy in the long run. Okay? Now, in the long run, what's going to happen here is that after a year or two, everybody's been expecting this inflation rate down here, right? We were calling that like pi star. Everybody thinks maybe like, 2% inflation is normal. But have we been actually getting 2% inflation? Well, no, we've been up here. Maybe this is like 4% inflation, okay? So for the last year, this is the inflation rate we're actually seeing, even though all the experts have been saying that 2% is normal. Well, here's the thing, guys. People aren't stupid. If everybody's been telling you 2% is normal, but what you actually see when you go to the store is 4% inflation, what are you going to start expecting after about a year or so? Well, you're going to stop listening to the experts. You're going to start expecting that 4% is the normal inflation rate. And we also know something. We know that in the long run, the economy always wants to be at equilibrium. So if the economy's hanging out over here, right, if we're a little bit overheated, unemployment is too low, like maybe unemployment's like 2% or something like that, well, we know that in the long run, that's not sustainable. In the long run, we're going to move back to equilibrium. That's one of our 12 principles of economics. So in the long run, as the economy moves back to equilibrium, the inflation rate up here at pi 1 is going to become the new expected inflation rate. And as the economy returns back to the natural rate of unemployment, we're going to have a brand new Phillips curve that will appear right here at this new inflation rate. So each of these Phillips curves corresponds to an expected inflation rate. So like if this one, just let's go put some numbers in here. If this one was 2%, then this SRPC, we could call it SRPC 2%. Basically, everywhere along this SRPC, people expect 2% inflation. But based on the unemployment rate, they may or may not actually get that expected inflation rate. If unemployment goes above the natural rate, they're going to get a lower than expected inflation rate. If unemployment goes below the natural rate, they're going to get a higher than expected inflation rate, at least in the short run. And then in the long run, our expectations will adjust to what that new inflation rate is. So in the case that we just looked at, right, we had a situation where unemployment went down and so inflation went up. When inflation went up, we're rational thinking people, so we adjusted our expectations. And as the economy moved back to normal, now we're going to have a new expected inflation rate, 4%. So now, and I'll just change my color so we don't get confused here. Now, everywhere along this green line here, this Phillips curve corresponds to an expected inflation rate of 4%, meaning that we all believe on this Phillips curve in this reality that 4% is normal, and we may or may not get 4% inflation. If unemployment goes higher than normal, we're going to get less than 4%, okay? But if unemployment goes lower than normal, we're going to get a greater than 4% inflation rate, and over time, our expectations adjust, and then a new Phillips curve appears. All right, let's look at another example. What if this time the government decided to do a contractionary policy to reduce inflation from its current rate at point A? So let's pretend, maybe in this scenario, this is a high inflation rate. Maybe it's like 8% inflation, okay? And so we're freaking out a little bit because the inflation rate is too high. So we want to push that inflation rate down. Well, if we want to push the inflation rate down, what's going to have to rise? At least in the short run. Yeah, unemployment's going to have to rise, okay? And so what that's going to do, let's say if, the Congress decides to raise taxes or maybe the Fed decides to sell bonds, right? Those are contractionary. We're going to see the unemployment rate rise, but the inflation rate's going to fall. So maybe unemployment was sitting at, I don't know, let's say 4%. Well, maybe now unemployment is somewhere like 6%. But inflation has come down. Maybe now inflation is down around 5%, which is a good thing because we want lower inflation, not higher inflation. But of course, we know that in the long run, the economy is going to want to go back to equilibrium. The economy is going to want to be back at the long run Phillips curve. So let's say that we've been at lower than expected inflation, right? In this case, expected inflation is 8%, but actual inflation is 5%. Well, over a period of time longer than a year, what are we going to start to think? Well, we're going to think that 5% is normal. Even though the experts have been saying 8%, we've been going to the store and actually seeing 5%. So if 5% is what we start to expect, all of a sudden, we're going to get a new short-run Phillips curve. And this new short-run Phillips curve is going to correspond to our new expected inflation rate of 5%. So like if this first Phillips curve was an 8% Phillips curve, this new one that we just drew is a 5% Phillips curve, okay? Now, this means that eventually we are going to get back to 4% unemployment, but that's only in the long run, okay? And so keep in mind, this is kind of like a triangular movement. We start at point A, we went down here, remember point B was right there, and then in the long run, we ended up back at point C. And remember that all this has to do with our expectations of inflation. When our expectations change, we're going to get a new Phillips curve that's going to correspond to what we expect the inflation rate is. Everything along this first Phillips curve right here corresponds to 8%, okay? Everything along the second Phillips curve down here corresponds to 5%. All right. Now, what's really handy, if you don't really understand this Phillips curve, but you do understand the ASAD model, you can fall back on what you know about the ASAD model to understand the Phillips curve. Because changes in the ASAD model can also be seen in the Phillips curve. An easy way to understand how changes in the ASAD model affect the Phillips curve is to think of the two sets of graphs as basically like mirror images, okay? But be careful, the two models are not equivalent. The ASAD model is static, but the Phillips curve includes change over time. So whereas the ASAD model shows one change or one-time changes in the price level as inflation or deflation, the Phillips curve actually illustrates continuous change in the price level as either increased inflation or disinflation. So, just a little side note for you, okay? Okay, so when I say that the Phillips curve and the ASAD model are mirror images, let's take a look at what I'm talking about. I'm going to put an aggregate model on the left and a Phillips curve over here on the right. Now, our aggregate model on the left, you may notice, is showing a recessionary gap. And so we're going to make our Phillips curve on the right look the same. Now, I, for some reason, neglected to put a long-run Phillips curve in there. So there's a long-run Phillips curve. Excuse my crude drawing. Okay, so you can see we're in a recession. if we're in a recession, Congress may want to do some fiscal policy. Like, for example, maybe they want to do a stimulus where they spend $100 billion on roads or something like that, right? They're going to build a bunch of roads, create a bunch of new jobs. Hopefully, if they create a bunch of new jobs, our output's going to rise. We know that if output rises, unemployment falls. And so that's the goal that they're going for. So let's see what would happen here if we were to do that. Now, we would have a rightward shift of our aggregate demand, which would get us back up here to equilibrium. That's where we want to be, right? We want to be back at our equilibrium up here. And by doing that, we're going to lower the unemployment rate, but unfortunately, it's going to cause some inflation. Now, you'll notice that the same thing happens over here on our Phillips curve. We started off here at an unemployment rate that was actually much higher than our normal unemployment rate. So, maybe this is like 4%. This right here could be like 7%, okay? Which corresponds over here, right? This would be 7% unemployment, and then this would be like 4% unemployment. Okay, when we did the fiscal policy, it caused the unemployment rate to fall. And so you can see that that's what we showed on our Phillips curve. We went from 7% to 4%. But it also caused the price level to rise. And so that's why our inflation went from pi to pi 1. Now, you'll notice that the lines are not actually a mirror image. It's not the lines that are a mirror image. It's the dots, okay? So you'll see that my first dot, we can call this like point A, was the yellow one. And then my second dot, we could call this one point B, is the orange one. So you can see that if you were to just drop like a mirror on the wall, let me see if I can draw a mirror. There's my mirror, okay? In between the two of them, the dots are actually mirror images of each other. See, like B mirrors B and A mirrors A. Okay, and so when I say that these two models are mirror images, that's what I'm talking about. So if you ever get a scenario and you're not sure what's happening, you could sketch out your ASAD model and then just make a Phillips curve that is a perfect mirror image. So if we had a change to consumer spending or business investment or government spending or net exports, aggregate demand shifts to the right, GDP increases, price level increases, unemployment decreases, and that means that the rate of inflation increases. So we go up and left along our SRPC, okay? All right, let's see what happens if we decrease aggregate demand. Maybe we're in an expansionary situation where we've got too high of a price level, i.e. we've got really high inflation. And once again, let's just say that like here's our natural rate of unemployment. We'll say UN right there. Okay, so in this case, once again, we're going to notice the dots are mirror images of each other. If Congress did something like raise taxes, that's going to decrease consumer spending and maybe some business investment, and that's going to shift aggregate demand to the left. That's going to drop the price level, but it's going to decrease our output, which means unemployment's going to rise. So over here, we need to show the same kind of thing. Higher than normal unemployment, okay? Or, you know what, if I was going to actually do this exactly right, I would put this, there we go, UN is right there. So just so that we don't get confused, let's put that in the right spot. Beautiful. Okay, so now you can see unemployment goes up, just like we see here, and price level goes down. And so once again, it's the dots that are a mirror image of each other. Okay, if this is dot A, then this is dot A. If this is dot B, then this is dot B. Okay? All right, now, you might say, okay, Mr. White, but what's up with the SRAS? What if we have a shift of our SRAS? What are we going to do with our Phillips curve? Well, this is where we can actually shift our short-run Phillips curve, and it's going to shift in the opposite direction. So if our SRAS goes to the right, short-run Phillips curve is going to go to the left. Like, let's say, for example, if we had a situation where productivity rises. More productivity is going to result in a rightward shift of SRAS. When SRAS shifts to the right, you're going to notice that price level goes down and unemployment goes down at the same time. When I say unemployment goes down, it's because, remember, output goes up. When output goes up, unemployment goes down. And so we need to show that same dynamic on our Phillips curve, and we need to mirror the dots once again. So you see if we got this here as point A, and this is point A, and then this is point B, we need to make this one point B. So what we do is we just shift our Phillips curve over to the left. We get our new short-run Phillips curve here in the yellow line, and you'll notice that now we've made our 2 points mirror each other. So the only time you shift your short-run Phillips curve is if something happens to change our inflationary expectations or any of those different inputs to our SRAS, right? Input prices, productivity, business taxes, regulations. If any of those things change, that's when you shift your short-run Phillips curve, okay? Now, If SRAS goes to the left, then you guessed it, short-run Phillips curve is going to go to the right. So if we start off in a situation like this where we're at equilibrium, and then let's say all of a sudden we had a situation where some stagflation occurred. Okay, stagflation is when our price level goes up and the unemployment rate goes up at the same time. We need to show that on our Phillips curve, and that can get kind of funky because we can't just have a dot just hanging out here by itself. So we're still going to put the dot out to the side so that we can make it mirror our aggregate model, right? So we still have point A, and we still have point B, and we have point B. But since you can't just have your dot for your Phillips curve just hanging out in space, that's why you go ahead and drop that green line through it, and you'll call that your new short-run Phillips curve. And so here, once again, you can see that we have an increase in price and an increase in unemployment all at the same time. So this could be the result of a change in inflationary expectations or any of those other inputs that go into our SRAS. Once again, like I said, input prices, productivity, business taxes, or changes to regulations specifically on businesses. So that's a lot to learn. It's a lot to take in. You may need to watch this video again, but here's a quick summary, okay? Basically, guys, there's a short-run trade-off between unemployment and inflation, and this is referred to as the short-run Phillips curve. In the long run, no trade-off exists between unemployment and inflation, and this is the long-run Phillips curve. That's why the long-run Phillips curve is perfectly inelastic at the natural rate of unemployment. The long-run Phillips curve exists at the natural rate of unemployment. One other thing I'll just drop in there too, sometimes this is called the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, which basically just means that when we're at the natural rate of unemployment, the rate of inflation is exactly what we expect. It's not going up, it's not going down. If unemployment goes above the natural rate, then what's going to happen is that inflation is going to decelerate, it's going to slow down. If unemployment goes below the natural rate, inflation is going to accelerate, it's going to speed up. And so that's why sometimes people would also call this the NAIRU. Don't be confused if you ever see that on a worksheet or something like that, okay? Now, if unemployment goes up, if the natural rate of unemployment goes up, the long-run Phillips curve shifts to the right. If the natural rate of unemployment goes down, the long-run Phillips curve shifts to the left. Changes to consumer spending, business investment, changes in government spending, and or changes in net exports would cause a change in aggregate demand. And that causes movement along the short-run Phillips curve. So guys, if it's an aggregate demand change, you don't need to shift your short-run Phillips curve. Just slide that dot up or down the short-run Phillips curve. If aggregate demand increases, right, then we're going to go up and left along the short-run Phillips curve. I guess you could say like northwest along the Phillips curve, okay? If aggregate demand goes down, right, if it decreases, we're going to go down and right along the short-run Phillips curve. I guess you could say southeast along the short-run Phillips curve. Now, changes to inflationary expectations or input prices or productivity or business taxes or regulation, that's going to cause a change to our short-run aggregate supply, and therefore it's going to change our short-run Phillips curve. It's going to cause it to shift either left or right. Remember, it's always going to shift in the opposite direction as the SRAS. So if it's something that makes the SRAS move right, put your short-run Phillips curve left. If it's something that makes your SRAS move left, short-run Phillips curve is going to go to the right, okay? Pretty simple stuff right there. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to email me, hit me up on Google Classroom or Remind. But that's all I got for you today. I hope you have a good one.